Imagine yourself in the year 1490, in the heart of Tenochtitlan, the dazzling capital of the Aztec Empire. The air smells of incense and roasted maize, and the streets hum with the sounds of marketplaces, prayers, and distant drums. Among the hundreds of thousands of people who live here, all eyes turn toward you. At just 17 years old, you have been chosen for what your family insists is the highest honor imaginable, to become the earthly bride of Silanen, the goddess of maize and fertility. Your parents weep with pride. Neighbors bow when you pass. For them, this is not tragedy, but triumph, a gift from the gods that will elevate your family's name for generations. From the moment the priest touched your shoulder and declared your destiny, you ceased being simply a daughter or sister. You became sacred property, revered, honored, and carefully controlled. Each morning, your new life begins with ceremony. Servants arrive before dawn to dress you in garments finer than anything you had ever touched before. Soft cotton, dyed with cochineal red and indigo blue, wraps your body. Golden ornaments, too heavy for comfort, weigh down your wrists and ears. A crown of fresh flowers is placed upon your head, their sweet fragrance masking the bitter smoke of burning copal that fills the temple halls. You are led through corridors where commoners kneel and whisper prayers in your direction, as though your breath itself might carry divine power. Meals are lavish, tamales wrapped in banana leaves, cocoa mixed with honey, roasted turkey seasoned with chilies. Foods forbidden to ordinary people are set before you daily, and each bite feels like an indulgence beyond comprehension. But beneath the richness of taste lies a quiet unease, for the meals are not chosen by you. Every morsel is prepared with ritual intention. Priests watch closely as you eat, recording your appetite, your demeanor, your silence. You begin to understand that even your hunger has become part of their sacred script. The days pass in a rhythm of honor and restraint. At times you are paraded through the temple courtyards, commoners lowering their heads as you pass. At others, you are kept indoors, hidden behind stone walls, while priests chant and scribes record omens. You are rarely left alone. Even when sleeping, you sense the presence of attendants seated nearby, as though guarding not only your body, but your very thoughts. What you once considered privacy no longer exists. At first, you tried to embrace the privilege. Who would not, when the empire itself seemed to bend around your presence? Yet, the more days you spent within the temple, the more you began to see the shadows behind the gold. The smiles of the priests never quite reached their eyes. Their voices, though soft, carried a weight that made your stomach tighten. Questions about the future were brushed aside with vague reassurances. All will be revealed in time. What should have been comforting sounded, instead, like a warning. Unexplained rituals marked your days. At dusk, attendants anointed your skin with oils, said to please the goddess, oils that stung faintly when they seeped into your pores. You were instructed to recite prayers that praised the goddess's sacrifice, her gift of maize, her eternal hunger. Each line ended with a phrase that unsettled you. As she gave, so must I. At night, the temple drums echoed through the city, their pounding rhythm like a heartbeat, reminding you that something waited ahead, something inevitable. Your family, once your closest comfort, now felt distant. Visits were rare, supervised, and painfully brief. When you looked into your mother's eyes, you saw love and fear. Her voice trembled when she told you to be strong, to embrace your role. Your father spoke only of honor, repeating the priest's words as if convincing himself. Their silence about what lay ahead was more haunting than any rumor. The whispers among temple servants reached your ears. Despite their attempts at secrecy, they spoke of other girls chosen before you, girls dressed in the same fine garments, girls who vanished after a single year. Their names were never spoken again. When you asked the priest directly, they smiled, praising your curiosity, and reminded you that to question the will of the gods was to question the balance of the cosmos itself. The truth revealed itself slowly, not through words but through atmosphere. You realized that the luxury was a mask, carefully designed to disguise your captivity. The clothing, the food, the reverence, none of it belonged to you. It was part of a performance, rehearsing you for a final act you had not agreed to. The priests watched not as caretakers, but as directors, ensuring you embodied the role of goddess's bride to perfection. You began to understand this honor was not meant to elevate you. It was meant to prepare you for destruction. And yet, every outward appearance told the opposite story. To the people of Tenochtitlan, you were a living goddess, radiant and deady, and destined for union with the divine. They saw reverence where you felt restriction. They saw blessing where you felt dread. In this contradiction lay the cruelty of your fate. You were celebrated even as you were condemned. As the year stretched before you, the boundary between honor and horror blurred until you could no longer tell them apart. Every ritual, every gift, every bow of respect carried the same unspoken truth. Your body no longer belonged to you. It was an offering, and the gods would claim it when the time came. To the outside world, you were blessed. Inside the temple walls, you were learning that blessings can be cages, and honors can be masks for terror. To understand why her luxury masked terror, we must look deeper into the system that built an empire on desire and fear. What happened to one girl inside the stone walls of the temple was not an accident of cruelty. It was not the whim of a sadistic priest or the tragic fate of a single family. It was the reflection of an entire system, a society that had fused desire, power, and religion into a single framework that touched every life in the empire. To understand her isolation, her conditioning, and the luxury that doubled as a cage, we need to look at the world that built it. The Aztecs believed the universe itself had been born from sacrifice. Their myths told of gods who tore themselves apart to bring the sun into motion, who offered their own hearts and blood to keep the cosmos alive. For ordinary people, this meant that suffering was not an accident of life. It was the very fuel that sustained creation. Desire, intimacy, and even pain were transformed into offerings for the gods. To eat maize, to give birth, to feel pleasure or fear. All of it was part of a larger cycle that demanded repayment. Nothing was free. Everything had to be given back. The theology was fertility deities, like Silonen and Quetzal, embodied not just crops and childbirth, but also sexuality, beauty, and temptation. Their myths framed intimacy as both a gift and to embrace the joys of the body was to acknowledge that one day the body itself might be claimed by divine hunger. This belief seeped into law, economy, and daily ritual until it was impossible to separate personal life from cosmic duty. The legal codes of the Aztec Empire, many preserved in colonial transcriptions, reveal strict hierarchies about who could touch whom and under what circumstances. A noble's concubine was not simply a companion. She was political currency, a symbol of status, and sometimes an offering promised to the gods. Ordinary couples, too, lived within rules that marked desire as sacred property. Violations of these rules were not just crimes against society, but cosmic offenses. To overstep boundaries of intimacy was to threaten the balance of the universe itself, a sin punishable by death or ritual punishment. Economics reinforced these patterns. Tribute lists, pictographic records meticulously kept by the empire, show that alongside maize, cacao, and textiles, people were part of the quotas demanded by the capital. Certain regions specialized in supplying young women, others in children or slaves marked for ritual duties. These weren't random victims plucked from villages in moments of chaos. They were systematically gathered categorized and transported along the same networks that carried food and precious goods. Human bodies were as much a part of empire building as stone or silver. Archaeology confirms what these records imply. Excavations at sites like the Templo Mayor in Mexico City have uncovered chambers not meant for worshippers, but for preparation. Rooms with wall carvings of fertility goddesses, altars bearing traces of bodily fluids, and implements designed for restraint. Bone analysis from mass graves shows repeated patterns of trauma, consistent not with sudden violence, but with long-term conditioning. These were not one-time acts of brutality. They were rituals rehearsed over generations, passed down as carefully as farming techniques or military strategies. Even Aztec poetry carried hidden codes. Surviving Nahuatl verses, celebrated for their beauty, often carried double meanings. On the surface, they praised flowers, maize, and love. Beneath the imagery, scholars have traced metaphors that alluded to rituals of intimacy and sacrifice. A flower plucked too soon, a bird pinned in its prime. These were more than artistic flourishes. They were veiled references to a society that had aestheticized suffering, turning abuse into a kind of divine literature. This fusion of religion, law, and economy made the system nearly impossible to resist. When intimacy itself is declared cosmic property, no one can claim private ownership of their own body. When laws describe desire as a debt to the gods, no refusal can be framed as moral. And when entire tribute networks deliver victims like shipments of grain, resistance becomes not just dangerous, but unthinkable. The machinery of empire made participation in suffering appear natural, even necessary. The scale was staggering. Conservative estimates, drawn from tribute records and Spanish accounts, suggest that tens of thousands of individuals each year passed through some form of ritualized intimacy and sacrifice. In Tenochtitlan, with its population of 200,000, ceremonies took place almost daily. Festivals of fertility, seasonal harvest rites, and state occasions each demanded new participants. The empire did not simply tolerate this system. It relied on it, binding political stability to cycles of ritual suffering. What makes this most disturbing is not only the numbers, but the way cruelty was disguised as devotion. To the outside eye, it looked like worship. Flowers scattered on stone steps, priests in feathered headdresses, music echoing across temple plazas. But behind the color and sound was a structure designed to normalize degradation, to convince entire communities that intimacy itself was a tool of cosmic balance. It was not random, it was engineered. And so the girl chosen as the goddess's bride was not an exception. She was a product of this system, caught in gears much larger than her own story. Her family celebrated because they had been taught to see the honor. The priests smiled because they believed her body would sustain the sun. The city bowed because the law demanded reverence. Each gesture of respect, each ritual of care, was another turn in the machinery of sacred desire. But as terrible as the system itself was, something even darker lay beneath it. For what is most chilling is not only that the Aztecs created these structures, but that human beings learned to accept them. They learned to see suffering as sacred, humiliation as honor, and destruction as destiny. But the most disturbing part was not the system itself. It was how human beings were conditioned to accept it willingly. The moment a young woman was chosen as the bride of a goddess, her old life ended. Family ties, personal name, and private identity were stripped away and replaced with something entirely constructed by the temple. She was no longer her parents' daughter, no longer a girl with childhood memories or dreams of a future. She became an object of ritual, an embodiment of divinity, and from that moment forward, every breath she took belonged to the gods. The first step was isolation. Once selected, the girl was removed from her home and placed within temple quarters where ordinary people could not enter. Visits from her family became rare, carefully supervised, and eventually forbidden altogether. The severing of human bonds was deliberate. By cutting her off from those who loved her, the priests ensured that her only relationships, her only sense of belonging, would form within the temple walls. It was a kind of social death, carried out before the physical one. Then came the renaming. The girl's birth name, Sil in this case, was slowly erased in favor of divine titles. Each day, the priest referred to her not as herself, but as Elonin's vessel, or the bride of the maize goddess. Over time, the repetition wore down her own sense of identity. To resist the name was to resist the goddess. To resist the goddess was unthinkable. By the end of weeks, many girls no longer thought of themselves as individuals at all, but as extensions of a divine being. The sacred education that followed was a carefully calibrated program of conditioning. On the surface, it looked like religious devotion, prayers, songs, symbolic dances, and ritual fasts. But beneath the pageantry was a subtler, more invasive purpose. Each prayer was phrased to remind her that her body was not her own. Each song glorified surrender. Each fast weakened her physically, making her more dependent on the temple attendants, who then provided restoration through controlled luxury. The cycle of deprivation and reward tied her emotions to the priests, making her gratitude inseparable from obedience. Rituals blended honor with humiliation. In the mornings, she might be paraded through courtyards, dressed in embroidered garments, and showered with flower petals, as commoners bowed in reverence. By evening, she would be required to undergo invasive examinations, disguised as purification rites, where her body was handled and scrutinized in the name of preparing her for divine union. The contrast was intentional. The dizzying alternation between reverence and violation disoriented her sense of self, making it nearly impossible to distinguish respect from abuse. The Spanish chronicler, Bernardino de Sahagún, who interviewed survivors and witnesses in the decades following the conquest, described these preparations in chilling detail. He noted how the chosen women were taught through endless repetition that their suffering was sacred, their resistance was sinful, and their eventual destruction was a cosmic necessity. Another chronicler, Diego Duran, observed that many of the girls accepted their role with what seemed like eagerness. But this eagerness, he clarified, was the product of careful and systematic persuasion, what we would now call brainwashing. The conditioning followed a predictable cycle. First, the girl was given luxury beyond her imagination. Rich foods, beautiful clothing, servants who treated her like royalty. Then came emotional attachment. The same attendants who served her also praised her constantly, creating the illusion of affection and loyalty. But slowly, these same figures introduced humiliation, reminding her that the beauty they praised was destined for destruction, that the body they served was already owned by the gods. In time, gratitude and dread became indistinguishable. Love and fear were welded together until obedience felt like devotion. To the outside world, it looked like worship. To the girl inside, it was an endless rehearsal for surrender. She was taught the positions she would hold on the altar, the words she would speak during the final ceremony, the expressions she should wear to please the crowds. Each lesson was framed as sacred education. But in truth, it was choreography for her own death. The most disturbing aspect was how effectively it worked. Many chosen women did not resist. Some came to see their fate as a privilege, even a destiny. They were told they were becoming one with the goddess, that their suffering would sustain the cosmos, that their families would be blessed through their obedience. And when all human connection outside the temple was severed, when every ritual reinforced the same message, belief became survival. To doubt the ritual was to doubt the very structure of the world. This was not random cruelty. It was systematic psychological manipulation, designed to break autonomy and replace it with submission. In modern terms, it bore all the hallmarks of trauma bonding, where kindness and cruelty intertwine until the victim feels loyalty to the very people who harmed them. The Aztecs had mastered this long before psychology gave it a name. By the time the girl reached the end of her year-long preparation, she no longer thought of herself as Syl. She had been remade into the goddess's vessel, rehearsed, conditioned, and convinced that her destruction was fulfillment. To outsiders, her calm acceptance looked like devotion. To the priests, it proved the success of their system. To us, it reveals how far human beings can be bent to accept the unacceptable. And if this was how individuals were broken, entire communities were reshaped through something even darker, festivals of sanctioned chaos. If the private conditioning of a chosen bride broke the will of an individual, the public festivals of Tenochtitlan revealed how entire communities were bound into complicity. Once a year, the empire erupted into ceremonies that seemed like celebrations of abundance, but concealed something far darker. These festivals were not about joy or release alone. They were carefully orchestrated inversions of morality, turning cruelty into a shared act of devotion. The most notorious were the fertility festivals. They began with offerings of maize and flowers, music echoing from temple plazas, and processions that wound through the crowded streets. From a distance, it might have looked like any great celebration, filled with color and song. But as the days progressed, the tone shifted. Alcohol, polka, fermented from the maguey plant, was distributed freely, a substance normally forbidden, except in ritual contexts. Hallucinogens were passed among participants. Mushrooms, morning glory seeds, herbs that blurred vision and judgment. The boundary between sacred and profane dissolved, and with it, the rules that governed daily life. The reversal of order was deliberate. Masters found themselves humiliated by servants. Children mocked their parents. Acts of violence and degradation, normally punished by law, were suddenly encouraged as expressions of divine release. What began as laughter often ended in screams. To refuse participation was to risk suspicion of impiety, even treason against the gods. Everyone joined, if only to protect themselves. The priests oversaw it all, from their elevated platforms. They guided the chaos like conductors of a symphony. Nothing was random. The distribution of intoxicants, the timing of rituals, the selection of victims, it was all structured. The temporary collapse of morality was not a breakdown, but a performance. By suspending ordinary rules, the priests bound the Edit city into acts they would never have committed under normal circumstances. When the chaos ended, guilt was shared by all, ensuring silence and complicity. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations near the Templo Mayor have uncovered chambers equipped not for prayer, but for restraint. Stone platforms, fitted with grooves that suggest binding. Some blupswares avoni. Then for control, the discovery of residues from hallucinogens within ceremonial vessels indicates that the distribution of intoxicants was systematic, not incidental. Bones recovered from festival layers reveal trauma patterns consistent with ritualized violence, inflicted not in private, but in the presence of crowds. These were not accidents of drunken revelry, but carefully maintained traditions of sanctioned cruelty. For Syl, chosen as the bride of Zilanun, the festival was the moment when private conditioning spilled into public spectacle. Draped in garments that proclaimed her sacred role, she was paraded before the intoxicated masses. The same people who had bowed in reverence during her year of luxury now reached for her, jeering and praising in the same breath, their boundaries dissolved by ritual and intoxication. She was both honored and humiliated, victim and performer, her suffering transformed into entertainment that affirmed the crowd's devotion. The most disorienting aspect was the way celebration and violence intertwined. Music swelled as she was forced into dances meant to mimic divine union. Movements drilled into her during months of training. Laughter erupted as rituals mocked the order of society. while cries of fear and pain rang from other victims, dragged into the plaza. To the participants, it was a holy inversion, a night when the gods themselves joined in chaos. To Syl, it was the final step in erasing the boundary between self and role, dignity and degradation. What made the festivals so powerful was not only the acts themselves, but the collective guilt they produced. When thousands of people drank, shouted, and acted out cruelty under priestly sanction, none could claim innocence. Each participant became part of the ritual machine, responsible for its violence, yet protected by the fact that everyone else shared the same guilt. It was a communal surrender, where society bound itself together, not by love or trust, but by mutual complicity in atrocity. Spanish chroniclers struggled to describe what they saw. Some compared it to hell, unleashed upon earth, a vision of communities dissolving into sanctioned depravity. Others admitted their language lacked the words to capture the spectacle, where joy and terror blended into something both intoxicating and horrifying. Even centuries later, the descriptions retain a surreal edge, as if the writers themselves could not decide whether they had witnessed religion or madness. For modern readers, it is easy to imagine these festivals as chaotic outbursts. But the truth is more unsettling. They were controlled, rehearsed, and purposeful. The priests used them as a tool of governance, a way to channel human impulses into forms that reinforced the authority of the temple. By giving people a taste of lawlessness under divine supervision, they made ordinary obedience seem safer by comparison, and by involving everyone in acts of cruelty, they ensured that no voice could stand apart in protest. For Syl, the festival stripped away the last fragments of freedom. Surrounded by the roar of the crowd, intoxicated faces blurred together until she could no longer distinguish worship from cruelty. She danced, she obeyed, she submitted, because to resist was to shatter the fragile identity the temple had built within her. Her suffering became part of a larger performance, swallowed by drums, firelight, and chants that echoed into the night. She was not alone in her degradation. Entire communities joined her. But the knowledge brought no comfort, and when the festival ended, when the fires burned low and the intoxicants wore off, the city returned to its ordinary rhythms, as if nothing had happened. But for Syl, and for thousands like her, the return of order brought no relief. The chaos had been only a prelude. What awaited was not freedom, but the final ceremony, the last act, in a life rewritten by the gods. But when the festivals ended, so did any illusion of freedom. For Syl, and thousands like her, there was only one final act. The final days of Syl's life were not filled with frantic resistance or desperate escape. They were filled with rehearsals. By then, her conditioning had done its work so thoroughly that the rituals of surrender felt like second nature. Each morning, she was led into the temple's inner chambers, dimly lit rooms, painted with the images of gods who demanded sacrifice and taught, step by step, how to act during her divine marriage. She was instructed on the words she would speak before the priests, the gestures she would make, even the expression she must hold on her face. She practiced lowering her head in reverence, practiced standing still while hands adorned her body with flowers, practiced lying on the altar with her arms gracefully extended. To her, these were not rehearsals for death, but lessons in how to fulfill her destiny. The priests whispered that every movement pleased the goddess, that every sign of obedience proved her worth. Rehearsal blurred into belief, and belief into acceptance. Luxury still surrounded her, but it had shifted in meaning. The rich foods and fine garments she was offered now felt less like indulgences and more like tools to sustain her for the final performance. Servants who once seemed to flatter her now reminded her gently that she was close to union with the divine. Their voices were soft, almost tender, but behind the tenderness was finality, Everything pointed to the same unavoidable end. On the morning of the ceremony, Syl was adorned like a bride. Her hair was braided with maize stalks, her face painted with yellow pigment, her body wrapped in a woven mantle embroidered with symbols of fertility. To the crowds gathering outside, she radiated beauty, holiness, and honor. Few, if any, saw the tragedy behind the radiance. The plaza overflowed with people. The air vibrated with the pounding of drums, the blast of conch shells, and the chanting of thousands of voices. To the people of Tenochtitlan, this was not murder. It was cosmic maintenance, the renewal of life itself. They had been taught, as Syl had, that the sun demanded payment in flesh, that the earth's fertility was purchased through human surrender. And so they watched, not in horror, but in devotion. Syl walked to the altar as if she were entering a wedding hall. Every step had been drilled into her, every motion rehearsed, until her body obeyed without hesitation. She lay down upon the stone slab, with the grace of a dancer, following her choreography. The flowers scattered across her chest, the chants echoing in her ears, all reinforced the illusion that this was fulfillment, not annihilation. The priests moved with solemn efficiency. They bound her gently, almost ceremonially, as though tying ribbons on a bride. Their faces showed neither cruelty nor pity. They were facilitators of a sacred act, convinced that their hands enacted the will of gods. Syl's eyes remained calm, even serene, not because she had found peace, but because she no longer recognized the difference between peace and submission. The crowd roared as the ritual began, not in outrage, but in affirmation. To them, this was proof of devotion, evidence that their empire remained in balance with the cosmos. The irony was cruel. The very people who had once bowed to Syl in reverence now celebrated the destruction of the role they had helped construct around her. The applause masked the silence of her own erased voice. Spanish chroniclers, who later described such ceremonies, often faltered at this point. Men like Sahagún and Duran admitted they could not record every detail, that some aspects of what they witnessed or heard were too obscene or too disturbing for their European readers. Their reports were censored, their language softened, and their metaphors stretched to hide what plain words could not bear. They left gaps where the most disturbing truths should have been. But archaeology has no need for discretion. Excavations at the Templo Mayor and surrounding sites have uncovered altars stained with residues, chambers designed for conditioning and restraint, skeletal remains marked with trauma that speaks louder than any sanitized chronicle. The evidence confirms what the Spanish could not bring themselves to write, that these rituals were not isolated, not exaggerated, but systematic, repeated, and celebrated for centuries. Scylla's story, preserved in fragments of testimony and in the logic of archaeology, is not unique. She represents thousands of girls and women drawn into the same system, trained to accept their destruction as holy, conditioned to believe obedience was fulfillment. Their lives were consumed by a society that weaponized desire, turning intimacy into a tool of cosmic terror. This is the disturbing side of Aztec desire. How a civilization so advanced in architecture, agriculture, and art could simultaneously normalize cruelty so profound that it erased even the instinct to resist. It is tempting to place this brutality safely in the past, to imagine it as the product of a distant and alien world. But the warning it carries is uncomfortably close. Human societies, when guided by power and belief, can transform almost anything into duty. Even suffering, even destruction. What is normalized is no longer questioned. What is sanctified is no longer resisted. And so, in the year 1490, as the drums echoed and the smoke of incense rose into the sky, Syl died, believing she had achieved divine union, proof of how far desire when weaponized, can erase even the instinct to resist.